My husband said that I am nothing without him. I showed him that it was the other way around. My husband, Derek, said I was nothing without him during an argument about me going back to work after 8 years of raising our kids. He said I'd been out of the workforce too long. Nobody would hire someone with my gap in employment, and I should be grateful he made enough money that I could stay home and play house. He actually said playhouse about raising his 3 children, managing his household, and handling every aspect of his life outside the office. He said, without his salary, his connections, his status, I'd be some nobody with no skills trying to get a minimum wage job. He said I should thank him daily for the life he gave me, because I'd contributed nothing of value to our marriage except birthing his children, which any woman could do. I asked if he really believed I was nothing without him, and he said it was just facts, that I'd been living off his success for nearly a decade and wouldn't survive a week without his support. He said the house was in his name, the cars were in his name, the bank accounts were his, and I existed because he allowed it. That night, I started planning his education. Derek was an executive at a consulting firm and constantly bragged about his presentations, his client relationships, and his ability to close deals. What he never mentioned was that I wrote every presentation he'd given for the last 8 years. I edited every email to important clients. I planned every business dinner at our home. I reminded him of every meeting, every birthday, every client's spouse's name. I packed his bags for trips with the right clothes for each event. I made sure he had backup phone chargers, the right adapters, and printouts of everything because he couldn't work his laptop properly. I sent gift baskets to clients' families when appropriate. I tracked his expenses and filed his reports because numbers confused him. I even logged into his work system at night to submit things he'd forgotten. Derek had no idea how much I did because I'd made it invisible, seamless, like he was just naturally that organized. Next Monday, I will stop doing everything. Derek woke up to no coffee made, no clothes laid out, and no lunch packed. He asked where his lucky tie was for his big presentation, and I said I didn't know. Maybe he should keep track of his own things. He laughed nervously and found a different tie. He grabbed his laptop bag and left, not realizing I hadn't charged his devices or put his presentation on the USB drives he always needed as backup. He also didn't notice I'd changed the password on the cloud storage where all his materials were saved, the account I'd set up and managed because he couldn't figure out two-factor authentication. Derek called me at 10, panicking because his presentation wasn't on his laptop. I said that sounded like his problem to solve. He asked for the backup USB, and I said I didn't know what he was talking about. He tried to log into the cloud account but couldn't. He had to present from memory, which meant he had nothing because I'd always prepared everything. His boss called it the worst presentation he'd ever seen and asked if Derek was having a stroke. The client walked out halfway through. That evening, Derek came home demanding to know what I'd done. I said I'd done nothing, which was exactly what he said I was, so it shouldn't matter. He said I was sabotaging him, and I said, how could nothing sabotage something? He tried to fix things himself, but didn't know any passwords, didn't have any client contact information saved anywhere he could access, and didn't even know his own calendar because I'd always managed it. Tuesday, he missed 3 meetings because I didn't remind him. On Wednesday, he showed up to a client dinner in jeans because I hadn't told him it was formal. Thursday, he forgot his biggest client's name and called him the wrong name during the meeting. Friday, his boss pulled him aside and asked if he was having personal problems because he'd become completely incompetent overnight. Derek begged me to help him, and I said he'd told me I contributed nothing, so my help shouldn't be necessary. The next week was worse. Derek walked through the front door that evening with his shoulders hunched forward and his tie hanging loose around his neck. His briefcase hit the floor with a thud that made Joaquin look up from his toy trucks. Derek stared at me across the kitchen counter where I was cutting vegetables for dinner, and his face had this mixture of anger and desperation that I'd never seen before. He asked how long I planned to keep punishing him, his voice tight and strained. I set down the knife and wiped my hands on a dish towel, taking my time before answering. I told him this wasn't punishment. It was education, and he needed to learn what his life actually looked like without my constant support. He opened his mouth to argue, but I turned back to the cutting board, dismissing him without another word. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, then grabbed his briefcase and disappeared into his office, slamming the door hard enough that Hannah came running to ask if Daddy was mad. Friday morning, Derek left early for the office, and I knew from his calendar that he had an interview scheduled with a potential assistant named Althea. I'd seen the email exchange where he'd tried to describe what he needed help with, and his requests were so vague they were almost funny. He came home just after lunch, which surprised me because he usually stayed at the office until evening. He walked straight to the kitchen where I was making sandwiches for the kids, and poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. I asked how the interview went, and he said Althea had declined the position after an hour of discussing the role. She'd asked him to explain his typical day, what systems he used, what his biggest challenges were, and he couldn't give her clear answers to any of it. She'd realized pretty quickly that Derek didn't actually understand what his job required on a day-to-day basis, and she'd politely told him she didn't think she was the right fit. He slumped against the counter and asked me again to help him, his voice breaking slightly. I told him he'd spent 8 years not knowing or caring how things got done, so a few weeks of figuring it out himself seemed fair. The weekend stretched out tense and silent between us like a wire pulled too tight. Derek holed himself up in the office on Saturday morning, and I could hear him moving papers around, opening and closing drawers, muttering to himself. I packed up the kids and took them to the park, needing to get out of the house and away from the suffocating atmosphere. Thea was quiet on the drive, staring out the window instead of chattering like she usually did. At the park, she climbed onto the swing next to me and asked why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking anymore. I pushed her gently, trying to find words that would make sense to a 7-year-old without making either of us the villain. I told her that sometimes grown-ups have disagreements and need time to work through their feelings, which was true but felt hollow. She asked if we were going to get divorced like her friend Emma's parents, and my stomach dropped. I promised her that Daddy and I were just having a hard time right now, but we both loved her and her siblings very much. She nodded but didn't look convinced, and I felt guilt settling into my chest like a stone. Monday morning of week 2 arrived with gray skies and a tension headache pounding behind my eyes. Derek left for work without eating breakfast, and I busied myself getting the kids ready for school and daycare. Around 10:30, I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard Derek's phone ring in his office downstairs. He must have forgotten it in his rush to leave. It rang 3 times, stopped, then started again. I ignored it and kept folding, but then I heard the house phone ring. I picked it up and a man's voice asked for Derek, saying it was Khalid and it was urgent. I told him Derek was at the office and suggested he try there. Khalid made a frustrated sound and said he'd been trying to reach Derek all morning about ending their contract. My hand tightened on the phone. He said last week's disasters had convinced him to take his business elsewhere, effective immediately. He was calling as a courtesy to let Derek know before he sent the official termination letter. I thanked him for calling and hung up, my heart racing. That was a $200,000 annual contract, one of Derek's biggest clients. I heard Derek's car pull into the driveway 20 minutes later, which meant he'd come home to get his phone. I stayed upstairs and listened to him check his messages, then heard his voice rising in panic as he called Khalid back. He was desperate on the phone, making promises about improving service and offering discounts and extra attention. Khalid must have been firm because Derek's voice got higher and more frantic, then defeated. The call ended and I heard him sit down heavily in his office chair. That evening, Derek sat at the dinner table but didn't eat, just pushed food around his plate while the kids chattered about their day. After I put them to bed, I found him in the living room with his head in his hands. He looked up when I walked in and his eyes were red. He said he was going to lose his job, that losing Khalid's contract was the final straw after the performance improvement plan. We were going to lose the house, lose everything, and it was all falling apart. I felt a sharp twist of fear in my stomach, because he was right about one thing. Our children's stability depended on that income. The mortgage payment alone was $3,500 a month, and that didn't count utilities, food, the car payments, insurance. But I forced myself to stay firm, to not give in just because he was finally feeling consequences. I told him he'd had 8 years to appreciate what I contributed, and he'd chosen to call it nothing instead. He said he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, but I couldn't let myself believe it yet. Sorry was just a word people said when they were scared, and I needed to see if he actually understood, or if he was just trying to fix his immediate problem. That night, Thea appeared in our bedroom doorway around 2 a.m, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She said she couldn't sleep and asked if she could get in bed with us. I lifted the covers and she crawled in between Derek and me, her small body tense. Derek was awake too, staring at the ceiling, and we lay there in the darkness with our daughter between us like a physical reminder of what was at stake. Thea's breathing eventually evened out, but I stayed awake, holding her, and feeling guilt creep through my chest like cold water. My revenge was affecting innocent people who hadn't called me nothing, who hadn't dismissed my contributions or made me feel worthless. Thea was having trouble sleeping because she could feel the tension between her parents, and that wasn't fair to her. I looked over at Derek in the dim light from the hallway and saw his eyes were still open, and I wondered if he was thinking the same thing. Tuesday morning, Derek tried to recreate the systems I'd built for him over the years. I watched him making lists on yellow legal pads, writing down client names and meeting times. He set reminders on his phone for every little thing, but he didn't understand the underlying logic of how everything connected. By Wednesday, he'd forgotten to follow up with 3 different clients who were waiting for proposals. He missed a deadline for submitting a report to Jerome. He sent an email to a potential client that was full of typos and unclear messaging, and the client responded asking if Derek was feeling all right. Thursday morning, he spent 2 hours looking for a file he needed for a presentation, tearing apart his office before finally finding it in the wrong folder on his computer. He called me from work, frustrated and exhausted, asking where I used to keep certain documents. I told him I used to keep them organized in a system that made sense, but since he'd never bothered to learn that system, he was on his own now. By Wednesday of week 2, Jerome called Derek into his office again. I knew because Derek texted me a single word, Jerome, at 2 in the afternoon. He came home at 4, looking like someone had drained all the color from his face. He walked past me without speaking and went straight to the office, closing the door quietly. I gave him 20 minutes, then knocked and went in. He was sitting at his desk staring at nothing, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were empty. Jerome had told him the performance improvement plan wasn't working, that his performance had actually gotten worse instead of better. Derek had 2 weeks to turn things around completely or face termination. 2 weeks to somehow become competent at a job he'd never actually done himself. To rebuild relationships with clients who'd lost faith in him, to prove he deserved to keep his position. He asked me what he was supposed to do, and I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make me responsible for fixing his mess. I watched my husband fall apart over the next few days and felt the satisfaction I'd expected mixed with something darker and more complicated. He wasn't learning or growing from this experience. He was just failing, sinking deeper into incompetence and panic. The point had been to show him what I contributed, to make him understand and appreciate my work. But instead, I was watching him drown. And our whole family would suffer if he lost this job, not just Derek. The kids would lose their school, their activities, their home. I'd proven my point thoroughly in 2 weeks, but the consequences were spiraling beyond what I'd intended. Derek wasn't becoming humble and grateful. He was becoming broken and desperate, and I started to wonder if I'd gone too far. Derek stopped eating properly and started drinking more, pouring himself whiskey in the evenings and sitting in the home office until midnight. I'd find him there when I got up to check on the kids, surrounded by papers and notes, trying to figure out work he'd never actually done himself. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook slightly when he picked up his glass. Friday evening, Hannah climbed into my lap while I was reading on the couch and asked me why Daddy was so sad all the time. She said he didn't smile anymore and he forgot to say goodnight to her last night. I held her close and felt my throat tighten because I had no good answer that didn't make me the villain. I couldn't tell her that Daddy had called Mommy nothing and I was teaching him a lesson. I couldn't explain that sometimes adults hurt each other and then hurt everyone around them in the process. I just told her that Daddy was having a hard time at work, and we needed to be patient with him, which felt like another hollow excuse in a growing list of them. I sat in the kitchen after putting Hannah to bed, staring at my phone and trying to decide if calling Camilla made me weak or smart. My hands shook as I scrolled to her name, and when she answered, I started crying before I could say hello. She told me she was coming over and hung up before I could argue. 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a bottle of wine, and that look she got when she knew I'd messed up, but wouldn't say it until I was ready to hear it. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything. How Derek had bombed presentations and missed meetings and lost clients. How Jerome had put him on a performance plan. How our kids were asking why Daddy seemed so sad. Camilla listened without interrupting, pouring wine and nodding, and when I finished, she asked me what my endgame was. I didn't understand the question at first, so she clarified that proving a point didn't matter if we ended up divorced and broke, that I needed to think about what I actually wanted from all this. I realized I hadn't thought past making Derek understand what I contributed, that I'd been so focused on his education that I hadn't considered where it would end. Now I was watching him drown, and our kids were suffering, and I didn't know how to stop what I'd started without admitting I was wrong. Camilla refilled my glass and said I'd proved my point in the first week, that Derek clearly understood now that he needed me, and I had to decide if I wanted to destroy him or save my marriage. She said those were the only 2 options left because the middle ground had disappeared when Jerome put Derek on notice. I told her I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to appreciate me. But she shook her head and said those 2 things had become the same thing whether I meant them to or not. Derek's career was falling apart, our finances were going to collapse, and the kids were watching their father break. All because I wanted acknowledgement. Camilla asked if the acknowledgement was worth what it was costing, and I couldn't answer because I didn't know anymore. She stayed until midnight, and when she left, I sat alone in the dark kitchen thinking about what I'd done and what came next. Friday morning, Derek left for work without saying goodbye, and I knew something bad was coming by the way he couldn't look at me. He came home at 3 in the afternoon, which was wrong because he never left the office before 6, and his face told me everything before he said a word. Jerome had demoted him from executive to senior consultant, dropping his title and his salary and his office with the window view. The demotion came with a 40% pay cut, and Derek stood in our kitchen telling me the numbers with dead eyes like he was reading a grocery list. He said Jerome told him he was lucky to keep any position at all given his recent performance, that the firm was being generous by not firing him outright. Derek looked at me and said I won, that I'd proved my point completely, and he hoped I was satisfied with the results. Then he walked upstairs and closed the bedroom door, and I heard the lock click. I stood in the kitchen trying to feel victorious, but only feeling sick, because this wasn't what winning was supposed to look like. That weekend, I spread our bills and bank statements across the dining room table while Derek stayed in the bedroom, and I did math that made my stomach hurt. His new salary barely covered the mortgage and car payments, leaving almost nothing for groceries or utilities or the kids' activities. We had some savings, but not enough to bridge the gap for more than a few months. And then what? I looked at Hannah's dance class tuition and Thea's art supplies and Joaquin's daycare costs, and I couldn't figure out how to make the numbers work. We'd been living a lifestyle that required Derek's executive salary, and now that salary was gone, cut by nearly half because I'd wanted to teach him a lesson. I thought about telling Derek we needed to talk about money, but he wasn't speaking to me and I wasn't sure I could face him anyway. Sunday evening, I made a list of what we could cut, which activities and expenses and small luxuries we'd have to eliminate, and the list got longer and scarier the more I wrote. Monday morning of week 3, I got the kids ready for school and watched them eat breakfast, really looked at them and saw how Thea had dark circles under her eyes, and Hannah was quieter than normal. Joaquin was too young to understand, but the girls knew something was wrong, could feel the tension between their parents even when we tried to hide it. I'd been so focused on Derek's destruction that I hadn't fully considered what it meant for them, how his failure wasn't just his problem, but our family's problem. They would lose things they loved because I'd engineered their father's downfall, would see their lives get smaller and harder because I wanted respect. Derek came downstairs in his work clothes looking like a ghost, poured coffee without acknowledging me, and left. I watched him go and felt the weight of what I'd done settle on my shoulders, heavier than I'd expected. The kids asked why Daddy didn't say goodbye, and I made up something about him being stressed at work. Another lie in a growing pile of them. That week, Derek stopped begging me to help and just accepted his new reality, going through the motions at his smaller job with his reduced responsibilities. He came home at 5:30 instead of 7, ate dinner in silence, and spent evenings in the home office doing work that didn't require my input anymore because it was simpler now. The defeat in his eyes made me feel sick instead of victorious because I'd wanted him to understand my value, not to break him completely. He moved through the house like a stranger, present but absent, and the kids noticed. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang with a call from Thea's school, and the teacher told me Thea had been acting out, getting into fights during recess and refusing to do her work in class. The teacher asked if there was anything going on at home that might explain the behavior change, and I had to admit there was marital stress, that Derek and I were having problems. The teacher suggested family counseling and said she'd be monitoring Thea's behavior closely, that another incident might result in suspension. I thanked her and hung up, then sat in my car in the school parking lot trying not to cry because now I'd hurt my daughter too. That evening, I tried to talk to Derek about Thea's teacher calling, about how the kids were noticing our problems, but he just looked at me with empty eyes and said this was what I wanted. He said I'd set out to prove he was nothing without me, and I'd succeeded, and now we all got to live with the consequences of my lesson. He was right and wrong at the same time, and I hated how complicated everything had become, how my simple plan for respect had turned into this mess that hurt everyone. Wednesday, I called a therapist and made an appointment just for myself, needing to sort through my feelings about what I'd done without Derek there to complicate things. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who listened to my whole story without judgment, and when I finished, she asked what I'd hoped to accomplish. I said I wanted Derek to understand what I contributed, to appreciate my work and respect my value. But as I said it out loud, I realized how much had gone wrong. The therapist asked if I'd gotten what I wanted, and I had to admit that Derek definitely understood now, but I felt terrible about it, that destroying him hadn't brought the satisfaction I'd expected. She said it sounded like I'd wanted acknowledgement and respect, not destruction, and those were very different goals. I left her office with homework to think about what I actually wanted from my marriage and whether it was still possible to get it. Derek's parents called that evening while I was making dinner, asking what was wrong with their son because he seemed depressed and wouldn't talk to them when they tried to check in. I deflected their questions, saying Derek was just stressed about work changes, but his mother pressed and said she knew it was more than that. I felt the weight of extended family getting pulled into our crisis, more people affected by my revenge, more collateral damage I hadn't thought about when I started this. His father asked if we were having marriage problems, and I said we were working through some things, which was both true and completely inadequate. After I hung up, I looked at Derek sitting in the home office, shoulders hunched over his laptop, and wondered how we'd gotten here, and how we'd ever get back. Monday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with bills spread across every surface, sorting them into piles I could pay and piles I couldn't. The mortgage statement showed we were current for this month, but next month looked impossible with Derek's reduced salary. The credit card bills had crept up over the past 3 weeks because I'd been too distracted by our crisis to monitor spending, and now the minimum payments alone ate up most of what remained after the mortgage. I pulled up our bank account on my laptop and watched the balance, doing math that didn't work no matter how many times I tried different numbers. Hannah's dance class tuition was due Thursday, $60 a month that suddenly felt like $600. I picked up my phone 3 times before finally calling the dance studio, and when the woman answered, I had to clear my throat twice before I could speak. I told her we needed to cancel Hannah's enrollment, and she asked if everything was okay, her voice full of concern that made me want to cry. I said we were fine, just some temporary budget adjustments, and she offered to put Hannah on hold for a month instead of canceling completely. I thanked her but said no, we needed to cancel. because I didn't know when things would get better, and I couldn't leave them hanging. After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone, thinking about how excited Hannah had been for her recital in December, how she practiced her turns in the living room every evening after dinner. Thursday afternoon, I picked Hannah up from the school and drove straight home instead of to the dance studio like we'd done every Thursday for the past year. She asked where we were going, and I pulled into our driveway, turned off the car, and told her we needed to talk. Her face went serious the way it does when she knows something bad is coming, and I explained that Daddy and I were having some money problems, so we needed to cut back on extras for a while. She asked if dance class was an extra, and I said yes, even though it broke my heart to call something she loved an extra. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and she asked if it was because of her, if she'd done something wrong, and I pulled her close and promised her this had nothing to do with her. She cried into my shoulder, asking when she could go back, and I had no answer that wouldn't be a lie, so I just held her and felt like the worst mother in the world. That evening, Thea asked why Hannah was so sad, and I had to explain to her too that we were cutting back on activities, which meant her art class might be next. Thea got quiet in that way she does when she's processing something big, and later I heard her telling Hannah they could practice dance together in the basement for free. Friday evening, Derek came home at his new regular time of 5:30, and for the first time in 3 weeks we sat down at the kitchen table together after the kids went to bed. We'd been avoiding each other, passing in hallways and speaking only about kid logistics, but the bills spread across the table forced us into the same space. Derek looked at the pile of unpaid statements, and I saw his shoulders slump, and neither of us spoke for a full minute. He finally said he knew things were bad, but he hadn't realized how bad, and I told him we couldn't make next month's mortgage if something didn't change. We sat there in silence again, both of us too tired and scared to keep fighting, and he admitted he never understood what I did, because he never had to think about it. He said he just woke up every day and everything worked, his presentations were ready, and his meetings were scheduled, and his life ran smoothly, and he genuinely believed that was just how things were. I told him I knew he didn't understand. That was the whole point of stopping. But I also admitted I took my revenge too far. He asked what I meant, and I gestured at the bills. At our quiet house where Hannah cried herself to sleep over canceled dance class, at the mess we'd made of our family. I said I wanted him to understand my value, but I didn't want this. Our kids suffering and our marriage destroyed and everything falling apart. Derek reached across the table like he might take my hand, but stopped halfway, and he said he was sorry for what he said, that he knew now it wasn't true. I asked if he really knew or if he was just sorry because his life fell apart, and he thought about it before answering that he didn't know. Maybe both. We talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had since this started, and by the end we agreed to try marriage counseling even though neither of us knew if it would help. Derek said he didn't know if he could come back from this professionally, that his reputation at the firm was destroyed. I asked what he meant, and he explained that even if I helped him now, Jerome and the other executives saw him fall apart completely, saw him fail at basic tasks and miss crucial deadlines. He said you can't unsee that kind of incompetence, that even if he recovered his performance, nobody would trust him with major clients or important projects again. I felt panic rising because I'd destroyed his career to prove a point, and now we had to live with that destruction. Saturday morning, we attempted something like normal family life, getting all 3 kids dressed and taking them to the playground near our house. Joaquin ran straight for the swings like always, too young at 3 to sense anything wrong, but Thea and Hannah stuck close to us in a way they normally didn't. Derek pushed Joaquin on the swings while I sat on a bench with the girls, and we all pretended everything was fine. Thea asked if we were getting divorced, and the question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I told her no. Daddy and I were just working through some problems, and she said her friend's parents said that too before they got divorced. Hannah started crying again, and I had to reassure both of them that we were staying together. We were just having a hard time right now. Derek came over and sat down, and we spent 20 minutes convincing our daughters that their family wasn't falling apart, even though we weren't sure ourselves. Sunday, we took them for ice cream, spending money we didn't have because we needed to do something normal, something that felt like our old life. The girls got chocolate cones, and Joaquin got vanilla in a cup because he always made a mess with cones, and Derek and I shared a strawberry sundae in silence. We drove home and put the kids down for quiet time, then sat in the living room not talking, just existing in the same space without fighting. It felt like a truce more than peace, both of us too exhausted to keep up the war. Monday morning, Derek's phone rang at 8:30 while he was getting ready for work, and I heard his voice go flat in that way that means bad news. He came downstairs already dressed, his tie crooked because I hadn't fixed it, and told me Jerome wanted to see him first thing. He left without coffee or breakfast, and I spent the morning cleaning the kitchen over and over, unable to focus on anything else. Derek called at 10 and asked if I could talk, his voice hollow and distant. I said yes, and he told me the firm was eliminating his position entirely in the next round of restructuring, that he had 6 weeks to find a new job or he'd be unemployed. I asked if this was because of his performance, and he said Jerome claimed it was about budget cuts, but they both knew the real reason. Derek said his damaged reputation made finding another executive position nearly impossible, That word traveled fast in their industry, and everyone knew he'd fallen apart. I felt my chest tighten because 6 weeks wasn't enough time. Not for the kind of job he needed. Not with 3 kids and a mortgage and bills we couldn't pay. He asked what we were going to do, and I had no answer. Just sat there holding the phone and feeling panic rise in my throat. He said he'd start looking today and hung up, and I stood in my kitchen feeling the full weight of what I'd done. Derek came home that evening at 4 instead of 5:30, and he walked in without saying hello or acknowledging the kids. He went straight to the home office and closed the door, and I followed him after a few minutes. He was sitting at his desk staring at his laptop screen, not typing or moving, just staring. I asked if he was okay, and he turned to look at me with completely empty eyes. He said the firm was eliminating his position. He had 6 weeks, and his reputation was destroyed. He spoke without emotion, just stating facts like he was reading a weather report, and that scared me more than if he'd been angry. I told him we'd figure it out, and he laughed, a short, bitter sound that didn't match his blank face. He asked how we'd figure it out when we couldn't pay next month's bills on his current salary, let alone with no salary at all. I said I didn't know, but we had to try to. He went back to staring at his laptop without responding. I left him there and went to make dinner, my hands shaking as I cut vegetables, thinking about how 6 weeks would pass faster than we could imagine. That evening, I broke my silence and went back to the office after the kids were in bed. Derek was working on his resume, typing slowly with 2 fingers because he'd never learned to type properly, and I pulled up a chair next to him. I told him to let me help with the descriptions of his achievements because he couldn't articulate them himself, and he looked at me with surprise and something like hope. We spent 2 hours rewriting his resume, with me translating his vague statements into concrete accomplishments, and it felt like surrender but also survival. I had to choose my children's welfare over my pride, had to accept that proving my point meant nothing if we ended up homeless. Derek thanked me when we finished, and I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The rest of the week we applied to jobs together, me writing cover letters that highlighted Derek's strengths while carefully avoiding his recent failures. I coached him on interview answers, helping him practice responses to questions about his experience and skills. It was exactly the dynamic that started this whole crisis, me doing the work while Derek got the credit. But now we both knew what we were doing and why. He didn't pretend the words were his own or that he'd figured things out himself, and I didn't pretend I was just helping a little. We sat side by side at the kitchen table every evening after the kids went to bed, him reading job postings while I crafted applications that might get him interviews. Thursday evening, Camilla came over after I texted her asking if we could talk. She brought wine, and I told her everything, about the bills and Hannah's dance class and Derek losing his job. I confessed that I was helping him now, writing his resume and applications, and I felt like I'd failed at proving my point. Camilla listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said I hadn't failed at all. She told me I'd proved my point completely in the first 2 weeks. Derek understood now what I contributed, and what I was doing now was choosing to save my family. She said that was different from giving up. That was making a choice about what mattered more. I asked if she really believed that, or if she was just being nice, and she said she believed it because she'd watched me fight for respect, and now she was watching me fight for my kids. We finished the wine, and she left, and I felt slightly less like I'd betrayed myself. By the end of week 4, Derek had 3 interviews scheduled, and I helped him prepare for each one. We practiced his answers to common questions, worked on his body language and tone, and I made sure he had printed copies of everything he might need. Before his first interview Tuesday morning, I straightened his tie and told him he could do this, and he thanked me with genuine gratitude I'd never heard from him before. He came home that afternoon and said it went okay. Not great, but not terrible. And we debriefed over dinner while the kids ate chicken nuggets. Wednesday's interview went better, and Thursday's best of all, and each time Derek thanked me after our prep sessions. He said he couldn't do this without me, and I told him I knew, and for the first time that acknowledgement didn't feel like a weapon or a wound. It just felt like truth we were both finally ready to accept. The first interview was Tuesday morning at a downtown office tower, and I drove Derek there because he was too nervous to drive himself. He kept checking his tie in the mirror and asking if his resume looked okay, and I told him it looked fine because I'd written it. I waited in the car while he went inside, checking my phone and watching other professionals walk past in their suits. 40 minutes later, he came back looking gray and defeated, and before I could ask, he said it went terrible. They asked him about his recent employment gap, and he tried to explain the performance issues without admitting he'd been completely dependent on me. The interviewer kept pressing about why his performance declined so suddenly, and Derek couldn't give a good answer that didn't make him sound incompetent. He said they thanked him for his time in that way. That means they're never calling back. Thursday's interview was worse because it was with a competitor firm where people knew his reputation. Derek came home after 20 minutes and said the interviewer recognized his name and asked directly about the client he'd lost. He tried to spin it as a communication breakdown, but the interviewer had already heard the real story through industry gossip. Derek sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands and said he was unhireable, that everyone in his field knew he'd failed spectacularly. I made him dinner and told him there were other options, smaller firms that wouldn't know his history. He barely ate and went to bed early while I stayed up researching companies that might give him a chance. Friday morning, I found him in the office staring at job postings, and I sat down next to him and said we needed to look outside his usual circle. We found a posting for a mid-level position at a smaller consulting firm across town, and Derek said it was beneath him. I reminded him that beneath him was better than unemployed, and he finally agreed to apply. I helped him write a cover letter that focused on his early career successes before I'd been managing everything, and we submitted it that afternoon. The following Monday, Derek got a call for an interview with the smaller firm, and he seemed cautiously hopeful for the first time in days. I coached him all week on how to be honest about needing to rebuild his skills without sounding like a disaster. Wednesday morning, he left for the interview wearing his best suit, and I told him to just be himself, but the humble version. 3 hours later, he called me from his car and said it went okay, maybe even good. The interviewer was younger and seemed more interested in Derek's willingness to learn than his past failures. Derek admitted he'd gotten too comfortable relying on support systems and needed to relearn how to work independently, and instead of dismissing him, the interviewer said that showed self-awareness. They talked about the position, and Derek was honest that it was a step down from where he'd been, but he was ready to start over. The interviewer said they'd call back within a few days, and Derek came home looking less broken than he had in weeks. I wanted to feel hopeful, but we were already into the 5th week since he'd been demoted, and the bills were piling up faster than we could handle them. Friday afternoon, Derek got an email about his severance package from his old firm, and the number was less than half what we'd expected. He called me into the office and showed me the screen, and I did quick math in my head that made my stomach hurt. We had maybe 3 months of expenses saved if we were careful, and that was assuming Derek found work immediately. Saturday morning, we sat down together with all our bills spread across the dining table, and Derek asked if we needed to sell the house. I looked at the mortgage payment and the car payments and the kids' school tuition and said maybe. We talked about pulling the kids from private school, and Derek said he'd never imagined his children in public school, and I reminded him that public school was fine for millions of kids. He got defensive and said he wanted better for his children, and I said better required money we didn't have anymore. The conversation went in circles until we were both exhausted and frustrated, and we agreed to wait until Derek had a job offer before making big decisions. Sunday afternoon, Thea came into the kitchen while Derek and I were going over the numbers again, and she asked what we were doing. I said we were just looking at boring adult stuff, but she stood there watching us, and finally she asked if we were poor now. My throat got tight, and I looked at Derek, who looked back at me helplessly, and I told Thea we were going through a hard time with money, but we'd figure it out. She asked if that's why we couldn't go to Disney this summer like we'd planned, and I said yes, we had to save money right now. Thea disappeared and came back 5 minutes later with her piggy bank, the ceramic unicorn she'd been filling with birthday money for 2 years. She set it on the table and said we could have her money if it would help, and I started crying right there at the kitchen table. Derek picked her up and hugged her and told her we didn't need her money, that parents take care of kids, not the other way around. Thea looked confused about why I was crying and asked if she did something wrong, and I pulled her into my lap and said she did everything right. She was the best kid in the world. After she went back to playing, I told Derek we had to fix this fast because our kids were scared. Tuesday morning, Derek got the call from the smaller firm offering him the position, and he put it on speaker so I could hear. The salary was 60% of what he'd been making at his old job, and the benefits were basic compared to what we'd had before. Derek asked if he could think about it and call back, and after he hung up, we both sat there in silence. I pulled out my calculator and started running numbers, subtracting the new salary from our current expenses. We'd have to cut almost everything extra. No more private school, no more cleaning service, no more gym memberships or subscription services. The mortgage would eat up half his paycheck, and we'd have maybe $2,000 a month for everything else. I told Derek we could survive on this salary if we changed our whole lifestyle, and he asked how much we'd have to change. I said significantly, maybe even selling the house eventually and moving somewhere cheaper. Derek put his face in his hands, and I watched him process that his choices had cost us the life we'd built. I said we didn't have better options right now, and he needed to take this job, and he nodded without looking up. He called them back that afternoon and accepted the offer, and his start date was set for the following Monday. Week 6 started with Derek getting ready for his first day at the new firm, and he looked nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. He asked me 3 times if his tie was straight, and if he had everything he needed, and I walked him through his bag like he was a kid going to the school. His phone rang during lunch, and I saw his name on the screen, and when I answered, he asked about how to handle a client situation he'd encountered. I talked him through it step by step, explaining how to research the client's background and what questions to ask. He thanked me genuinely and said he'd call me if anything else came up, and I said that was fine. When he came home that evening, he looked tired but not defeated, and he said his new boss seemed patient and willing to teach him. We ordered pizza for dinner because neither of us had energy to cook, and after the kids went to bed, we sat them down in the living room. Derek started to explain that things were going to change in our family, that we'd be moving to a smaller house and they wouldn't go to their current school anymore. Hannah's face crumpled and she asked if it was her fault, if she'd done something wrong. I pulled her close and promised her that adult problems were never children's fault, that sometimes families had to make changes, but it didn't mean anyone did anything wrong. Thea asked if we'd still be together, and I said yes, we'd all be together. That was the most important thing. Joaquin didn't understand what was happening, and just wanted to know if he could bring his toys, and Derek assured him he could bring everything important. By the end of week 7, we'd looked at 6 smaller houses in decent school districts, and each one felt like a step down from our current home. Derek kept apologizing as we walked through cramped kitchens and tiny yards, and I could see him processing what his words had cost our family. After viewing a 3-bedroom ranch that smelled like old carpet, Derek said he was sorry for taking our old life for granted. I said we'd been taking it for granted together, both of us living beyond what we could actually sustain. We sat in the car outside the house, and I told him I was sorry too, for pushing my revenge so far that I'd hurt our kids and put our stability at risk. We'd both made mistakes. His in dismissing everything I did, and mine in proving my point at everyone's expense. Derek reached over and took my hand and said we'd figure this out together, and I believed him for the first time in months. The following Tuesday, we found a 3-bedroom house that was half the size of our current one, but had good bones and a fenced yard. The mortgage would be affordable on Derek's new salary with some help from money I'd started making doing freelance writing and editing. I'd signed up with 3 platforms that connected writers with clients, and I was finally using my skills for actual paid work, instead of just supporting Derek for free. My first month, I'd made $800 writing website content and editing business documents, and it felt powerful to have my own income. Derek was proud of me in a way that felt genuine, not patronizing, and he encouraged me to take on more clients. We started marriage counseling the following week, and the first session felt like sitting in a doctor's office waiting for bad news. The counselor asked us to explain why we were there, and Derek looked at me like he wanted me to talk first, but I stayed quiet. He finally said we'd had some problems with communication and respect, and I almost laughed at how small he made it sound. The counselor asked me for my perspective, and I said my husband told me I was nothing without him, so I stopped doing everything I'd been doing for 8 years and watched his life fall apart. She wrote something down and asked Derek if that was accurate, and he nodded without looking at either of us. Over the next few sessions, we worked on what the counselor called establishing new patterns, where Derek had to actually say out loud what I contributed, instead of just assuming I'd handle everything. It felt awkward and forced when he thanked me for editing an email, or reminded himself to ask if I needed help with dinner. The counselor made us practice conversations where I stated my needs directly, instead of hoping Derek would notice and appreciate things on his own. I had to say things like, I need you to take the kids to the school tomorrow because I have a client meeting, and it felt strange to ask for help in my own marriage. Derek started keeping a list of household tasks and childcare duties on his phone, so he'd remember to do them without me reminding him. The counselor said we were rebuilding from scratch, and it would take time to feel natural. By week 8, we'd settled into a new routine where Derek actually did laundry and cooked dinner twice a week and helped get the kids ready for bed every night. He was terrible at all of it in ways that would have been funny if they weren't so frustrating. He shrank 3 of my shirts by washing them on hot and burned spaghetti sauce because he walked away from the stove to check his phone. He put Joaquin's pajamas on backwards and forgot to brush Thea's hair before school, so she showed up looking like she'd been in a windstorm. But he was trying in a way he never had before, and I could see him actually thinking about what needed to be done instead of just assuming I'd handle it. When Hannah asked him to help with her homework, he sat down and worked through the math problems with her instead of calling me over to do it. When Thea needed a permission slip signed, he found it in her backpack and signed it himself instead of leaving it on the counter for me to deal with. The house was messier and dinner was later and things didn't run as smoothly, but we were actual partners now instead of me being his personal assistant. Derek came home from work one evening in week 8, looking less tired than he had in months, and told me his new boss had complimented his presentation that day. The new firm was smaller and less prestigious, but his boss actually taught him things instead of just expecting him to know everything already. Derek said he'd stayed late to help a junior consultant with a client proposal, and his boss noticed and thanked him for being a team player. I felt genuinely happy for him instead of bitter or resentful, because we were on the same team now and his success didn't come at my expense. He asked about my freelance work, and I told him I'd landed a new client who needed weekly blog posts, and he got excited and suggested we celebrate with takeout. We couldn't afford anything fancy, but we ordered Chinese food and ate it with the kids, and Derek told them about his good day at work. Thea asked if Daddy was happy again, and he said he was getting there and pulled her into a hug. We closed on the smaller house in week 9 and spent the weekend packing up 8 years of accumulated stuff. The kids helped put toys in boxes, and Derek labeled everything while I wrapped dishes in newspaper. Thea walked through her new room when we went for the final walkthrough, and said she liked that it was closer to our room so she wouldn't be scared at night. Hannah was excited about the park we could see from the kitchen window and asked if we could go there after we moved in. Joaquin didn't understand what was happening, but he liked the boxes and kept climbing into empty ones. Derek's hands shook a little when he signed the closing papers, and I knew he was thinking about everything we were giving up. But he also squeezed my hand when we got the keys and said this was going to be good for us. My freelance writing had grown to the point where I was making enough to cover our grocery bills and utilities each month. Having my own income felt powerful in a way I hadn't expected, because it meant I wasn't completely dependent on Derek's salary anymore. I had money that was mine because I'd earned it with my own skills and effort. Derek encouraged me to take on more clients and talked about my work with genuine pride, instead of the dismissive tone he used to use when I mentioned wanting to go back to work. He read an article I'd written for a business website and told me it was really good, and asked if I could help him with a report he was writing. I said yes, but made sure he understood I was helping as a partner, not as his unpaid assistant, and he agreed, and offered to pay me my freelance rate. I didn't take his money, but I appreciated that he offered. The move happened in week 10, and our new house felt cozy instead of cramped, even though it was half the size of our old place. We had less space for stuff, which meant we had to get rid of things we didn't actually need, and the kids adapted faster than I expected. Thea and Hannah shared a room now, and they decorated it together with posters and stuffed animals. Joaquin's room was tiny, but he didn't care because he spent most of his time playing in the living room anyway. Derek and I had a smaller bedroom with less closet space, but we didn't need as much room for the fancy clothes he used to wear to impress clients. There was less tension in the new house because we weren't trying to maintain a lifestyle we couldn't actually afford, and there was more honesty because we both knew exactly what we'd almost lost. Derek's parents visited 2 weeks after we moved in, and his mother walked through the house with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She made a comment about how cozy everything was in a tone that clearly meant small, and asked if we were planning to upgrade once Derek got back on his feet. Derek told her we weren't planning to upgrade because we were building something more sustainable, and this house fit our actual needs and budget. His mother looked surprised that he'd pushed back and started to say something else, but Derek cut her off and said he was proud of what we were building together. I felt grateful for his support because his parents had always made me feel like I wasn't good enough for their successful son, and now he was defending our choices to them. 3 months into the new job, Derek came home with actual excitement in his voice and told me he'd gotten a small raise and a positive performance review. His boss had said Derek showed real potential and strong work ethic, and was becoming a valuable member of the team. It wasn't the kind of praise Derek used to get when he was an executive, but it was earned through his own actual work instead of my invisible support. We celebrated with takeout pizza because that was what our budget allowed now, and the kids thought it was a party. Derek told them he'd gotten a gold star at work, like they got at the school, and they cheered for him. We ate pizza on paper plates in our small living room, and it felt more real than any of the fancy dinners we used to host in our old house. Thea's teacher called in month 4, but this time her voice was cheerful instead of concerned. She said Thea had been doing much better lately, and seemed happier and more settled at the school. The acting out had stopped, and Thea was participating in class and playing nicely with other kids. The teacher said whatever we'd changed at home was clearly working, and she was glad to see Thea thriving. I felt relief wash over me because I'd been so worried about the damage my revenge had done to our kids. Knowing that Thea was doing better meant we were actually repairing things instead of just pretending everything was fine. Camilla came over to the new house on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat in the small backyard while the kids played in the park across the street. She looked at me for a long moment and said, I looked lighter somehow, like I wasn't carrying as much weight on my shoulders. I realized she was right because having Derek as an actual partner instead of another child to manage had freed up mental space I didn't even know I was missing. I wasn't tracking his schedule or writing his emails or managing his entire life anymore, and that meant I had energy left over for myself and my own work. I started working more with my freelance clients, and Derek kept asking if I needed help with proposals or emails. I told him I could handle my own work, and he nodded but still offered suggestions when I was typing at the kitchen table. The kids noticed the change between us, and Thea asked one Saturday morning if Mommy and Daddy were friends again. Derek looked at me across the breakfast table and said we were learning to be better friends than we'd been before. Hannah wanted to know what that meant, and I explained that sometimes grown-ups have to figure out how to be nicer to each other. Joaquin just wanted more pancakes and didn't care about the conversation. That afternoon, while the kids played in the yard, Derek brought up something that had been on his mind. He said he'd been thinking about what Thea and Hannah would learn from watching us, and he didn't want them to grow up thinking marriage meant one person doing everything while the other person took credit. I agreed and said I wanted our daughters to expect real partnership in their relationship someday. We talked about how Thea was already watching how Derek treated me and how I responded to him. Derek said he wanted her to see a dad who respected her mom and did his share of the work. I told him I wanted Hannah to grow up knowing her contributions mattered, and she shouldn't have to make herself invisible to help someone else shine. We agreed to be more careful about modeling the kind of marriage we wanted our kids to expect for themselves. 6 months passed since everything fell apart, and our bank account stayed steady instead of dropping into panic territory every month. Derek's salary covered the mortgage and basic bills while my freelance income paid for groceries and the kids' activities. We weren't rich anymore, but we also weren't stressed about money the way we used to be when we were pretending to afford a lifestyle we couldn't actually maintain. Our marriage felt different now because we both knew exactly what the other person contributed, and we said thank you for things that used to be invisible. Derek thanked me for editing his work emails, and I thanked him for doing the grocery shopping. We still argued sometimes about who forgot to pay which bill or whose turn it was to drive carpool, but the arguments didn't have the same poison they used to carry. There was honesty between us now, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. One evening after the kids went to bed, Derek told me something I wasn't expecting. He said he was grateful for what happened even though it was the worst few months of his life. I looked at him confused, and he explained that he'd been turning into someone he didn't like. Someone who thought his job title made him better than other people. He said losing everything forced him to see how much he depended on me and how little he'd appreciated that dependence. I told him I was grateful too for finally learning to value my own work instead of hoping someone would notice it. I said I'd spent 8 years making myself small so he could feel big, and I didn't want to be small anymore. Derek nodded and said he didn't want me to be small either because that wasn't actually good for anyone. We built something different from what we had before. Smaller in obvious ways like our house and our bank account, but bigger in ways that mattered more. Our kids saw parents who respected each other instead of parents where one was in charge and one was invisible. Thea asked me one day if I liked my job, and I said yes because it was mine and people paid me for it. Derek heard that conversation and later told me he finally understood that I was never nothing like he'd said. He said I was everything that held our life together, and he'd been too stupid to see it. I told him we were something together now instead of me being his shadow. We were building a life that fit who we actually were instead of who we'd been pretending to be.